We have been on the series of the Apostle Peter, and today I want to continue on that series. This is a topic that is a little bit sensitive because I'm talking about the life of the Apostle Peter, and many times he is looked upon as a buffoon of sorts. But I think that is a bit of an unfortunate representation. There's a lot that we can learn from him. And today I'd like to entitle this message as Apostle Peter, the Lesser Child. Let's switch this on. Okay. We'll be reading from two different passages, Galatians 2 and 2 Peter 3. Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. When Cephas came to Antioch, that is, this is Apostle Paul speaking. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs?" This is our first reading for today. Our second reading is from 2 Peter chapter 3. So the first reading is Paul's comments about Peter. The second reading is Peter's comments about Paul. Right? 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 14. So then, dear friends, since you are looking forward to this, make every effort to be found spotless, blameless, and at peace with him. Bear in mind that our Lord's patience means salvation, just as our dear brother Paul, who also wrote you with the wisdom that God gave him. He writes the same way in all his letters, speaking in them of these matters. His letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort as they do the other scriptures to their own destruction. Okay. First of all, let's take a look at what this passage is about. See, I think the reality is that conflicts will always arise in life. And to pretend that there is no conflict among believers is rather disingenuous. There will be conflicts. And it is a passage, honestly, that I'll rather avoid touching on, because this is a passage that concerns the conflict between Peter and Paul. By the same token, it is usually in conflicts that a person's core character comes out. It is in conflict that you begin to see how aggressive, how kind, how they interact with one another. You know, when everything is fine, it is okay. But when there is a conflict, how do people behave? So this is a very important passage really in the early church, or in understanding the early church. In Galatians chapter 2, we actually have a conflict between two important people, Peter and Paul. Cephas is Peter's Hebrew name, and here this is the preferred name that Paul uses for Peter. So it's the same person. Now today we look at this rather difficult passage from Galatians, and then we see that Peter, after about 10 years, had certain things to say about Paul in 2 Peter chapter 3. So first of all, let's look at the events in Galatia. What happened at that point in time? Now this Galatia is probably the Galatia of the south. There were two Galatians in those days. There's a northern Galatia and a southern Galatia, and this is probably the southern Galatia. You read about these cities inside the book of Acts, about Lystra, Derbe, Iconium. These are the cities of Galatia, southern Galatia. So most people believe that Paul wrote to the churches in South Galatia. Now this incident happened in Antioch. So he was writing to the Galatians about something that happened in Antioch. Antioch, you will recall, was the place where Gentiles were converted en masse, right? The people reached out to the Gentiles in Antioch, and that was where Christianity was embraced by Gentiles. And then the Jerusalem church didn't really know what to do because they were all Jews. So what rules apply to Gentiles? So they sent a delegation to Antioch to see what was to be done. And eventually Barnabas was sent there, and Barnabas brought Saul out of exile, so to speak, to minister in Antioch. So Antioch was Paul's home base. Antioch was Paul's home base. And so he said when Cephas came to Antioch, basically it was a situation when Peter went to Antioch on a visit. Now, Peter and Paul were working together in Antioch at one time. So at one time they met each other in Antioch and they were working together. Peter had successfully brought Jews to faith, but the main congregation in Antioch was still Gentile. So there was a minority of Jews there. And when Peter was there living among the Gentiles, he was living as a Gentile, meaning that he was eating food that the Gentiles ate. He was not keeping special dietary rules or anything like that. He was living like a Gentile. But then came a delegation from James, meaning from Jerusalem. James was the chairman of the church in Jerusalem. So a delegation from James, certain men, indicated to us that it was probably official or quasi-official capacity that they came. So they came and they said some things to Peter, and then Peter withdrew himself from the Gentiles with whom he was eating. Okay, and this got the Apostle Peter very upset. And that was the cause of this conflict between the two. He says that when they arrived, that is the people from James, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. Then other Jews began to join him as well. So the church began to split up. Then you have one Gentile faction and one Jewish faction, and they were meeting separately and eating separately. Now, eating was vital to the early church. It was a little bit like what we have in our meal before our meeting. For them, the Holy Communion was a full meal. It was not, just representative. It was a proper meal, like the Last Supper. Okay. And the whole point about this meal is that it demonstrates fellowship and solidarity, that we are breaking bread together. We are all of the same body. We are all of the same family. But now that the separation has occurred, it suggests that there are two different groups, two different sets of rules within one community. And so this became a rather serious matter. And then we are told that other Jews began to join Peter, and even Barnabas was led astray. Now, when you look at the word hypocrisy, it sounds like a very strong word, and in English it is. But in the Greek, it doesn't carry the same sense as it does in the English. A hypocrite is a person who is an actor. That's what it is. So it comes from the word acting, meaning that you are acting one thing here and you're acting another thing over there. Okay, so there's more inconsistency in our understanding than the word hypocrisy in our usage today. Okay, so this was what happened during that time. Now, in our day, I suppose you would be saying something like this to Peter. Okay, you'll be saying, Peter, you really mustn't eat with the Gentiles and eat all these unclean foods. And Peter will ask you, why is that so? And then the reply will come, because when you do that, you cause all our Jewish brothers to stumble. Okay. Remember we were talking about stumbling block and what that means, and how it is not necessarily bad, because Jesus was called the stumbling block. He was one that caused Israel to stumble. He did things that Israel could not accept. So there are many times when stumbling block is used in a bad sense, and there are many times when stumbling block is used more in a neutral sense. So here we have a situation where it is very easy for someone to pressure Peter not to eat with the Jews, not to eat the Gentiles, because the Jews are going to be very offended by your course of actions. I can imagine if I were the advocate from James telling Peter, and don't forget that your main ministry is among the Jews. So you need to behave in such a way that Jews find you acceptable. Paul's ministry is to the Gentiles, so even if you were to offend the Jews, it doesn't matter. But your ministry is among the Jews, and therefore you need to be extra sensitive to the Jews. And again, all these things can sound very reasonable. And I think this is why Peter sort of went a little bit off target at that point in time. There was no question in the minds of the early church that the Gentiles could eat whatever they want. They had already decided at that time that Gentiles need not be circumcised. The big but is this: what about Jewish Christians? Do Jewish Christians keep Jewish laws or do not keep Jewish laws anymore? What about babies that are born to Jews? Do you circumcise them or do you not circumcise them? Do you circumcise them like Jews or do you not circumcise them like Gentile Christians? Okay, so there was the big debate going on. So actually this was right in that dividing line. So it is quite clear Gentiles don't have to keep dietary laws, but the Jews have been keeping dietary laws all along. Now that Jews are converted, do they now begin to live more like Gentiles or not? And so Peter was persuaded by this group not to live like the Gentiles. But Paul says, but that is not being consistent. Before these guys came, you lived like the Gentiles. You did not separate yourself from the Gentiles. But now that these people come, you separate yourself, and now we have two different camps in the Christian community. So he said, when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, meaning that before the Jews came, you lived like a Gentile. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? So by creating this division within the church, they created a first-class, second-class situation. The first-class Christians were the Jews who also kept circumcision and the dietary laws, and by way of concession, you Gentiles don't have to be circumcised, don't need to keep the dietary laws. So they created this first and second-class situation within the church community. Now many people have asked things like, what was before or after the Jerusalem Council? You see, in Acts chapter 15, there was a Jerusalem Council that talked about the question of Gentiles. Do Gentiles need to follow Jewish laws or not? And the answer was no, they don't have to. So some people said that this event happened before the Acts 15. Some said it happened after, and scholars are quite divided on that, and they continue to fight. So that is not what we're trying to resolve today, so I will not bother to go into it, but just to highlight to you that there is quite a bit of background. And the big struggle within the early church was this whole issue of Jewish Christians versus Gentile Christians. Now, Peter himself was clear that there were no dietary restrictions needed for the Gentiles or for himself. You'll recall in Acts chapter 10 that he had a vision with the sheets that came down from heaven and all kinds of animals, and the voice says, kill and eat these animals. And he said, I cannot do it. But eventually he understood that he was going to talk to Cornelius, a Gentile. But the literal meaning should also be accepted. The literal meaning is that you can now eat any animal. So Peter himself was very clear that he could eat any animal. Okay. He was the one who stood up in the Jerusalem Council, who defended the rights of Gentiles to come to Christ without becoming Jews. So the issue was about Jewish practice. And the problem was that by doing what he did, the Apostle Peter threatened to split the church. Now, then we come to what happens and how it relates to the Apostle Paul. This was about 10 years after the events in Antioch. Okay? The events in Antioch could have been anywhere from some say 49 or 50 AD. Okay, so this is probably 60-something AD when 2 Peter was written. Now look at how he writes about the Apostle Paul. First of all, when you read this passage, you do not catch any hint of resentment against Paul, right? He says that just as our dear brother Paul also wrote you with the wisdom that God gave him. There is no sense of anger or resentment towards Paul at all. Okay. So this is the first point that I like to bring up. That the humility of Peter. The humility of Peter. You see, Peter accepted Paul's public rebuke. And as it turned out, Paul was right, Peter was wrong. He accepted Paul's public rebuke and in a somewhat humiliating reprimand. He was the most senior, or the chief of the apostles, so to speak. And here was the youngest, the newest of the apostles, telling him that he was off target, and that so in public. Now there was a lot at stake, and as it turned out, Paul was right and Peter was wrong. But still, it would have been a very difficult time for Peter in terms of personal pride and ego. Okay. Now, some argue that Paul was right in confronting Peter this way. Some said that, while the content was right, he should have maybe done it in private or whatever. But I think we speak all these things from our own cultural background. If you are a Westerner, you would be more prone to say, it should be a more direct confrontation. If you are from the East, you would have said probably it is better to pull him aside and talk to him privately. So I think we put in a lot of our personal perspectives into it. But whatever the case, it would have been difficult. It would have been difficult under any cultural circumstances for Peter to accept this reprimand or rebuke from the Apostle Paul. Now, here I think Peter's humility really stands out, because he accepted a public reprimand and he did not react against it in a negative way or harbor it in his heart in a negative way. Here we find authenticity among God's people. People can make mistakes. The Apostle Peter can make mistakes, but he's also prepared to accept correction, even from someone who was his junior. There was also a community acceptance. The community could also accept that Peter, an apostle, could make mistakes. That we are not above mistakes. We look at apostles and we think of them very highly, as we ought to, but not everything that the apostles wrote was inspired. Of course, the epistles that they wrote was inspired by God, but the shopping list that they wrote is not inspired, or if they are doodling something, it is not inspired. So they are ordinary people like us, prone to mistakes and capable of stumbling and tripping and doing the wrong things. Now, there are times when we have to take a public stand for the truth, and I think this was the case for the Apostle Paul. He had to take a public stand. You see, if we never stand for truth, I think it demonstrates only one thing about us: cowardice. Because I do not believe that there is no time in your life that you do not have to speak up for the truth. Okay. So if you never have to speak up for the truth, perhaps it is because by nature you are timid and you are a bit cowardly. But if you are always standing up for the truth, always contending, then perhaps you are being quarrelsome. That, you are quarrelsome and you are using the faith as an excuse to express your aggression and your quarrelsomeness. Some people do that. They are quarrelsome by nature, and so now that they are Christians, they have a very good reason to be quarrelsome. They look for people to quarrel with. Okay. So we don't want either extremes. We don't want people who never stand for the truth, and we don't want people who, in the name of truth, is always fighting and arguing with somebody else. That neither is the sample or the model that is given to us. Now, here we have a very important lesson for us. That is, we must not give way to legalists. See, there are those of us Christians tend to be generally conservative people. And we say that we stay as far away from problems as possible. And to be conservative is good. Well, here the problem was with the conservatives. The conservatives were the ones who say, let's go back to circumcision, let's go back to dietary laws. And the less conservative were the ones who said, there's no more need for circumcision, there's no more need for the dietary laws. So I think it is important for us to get things right. It is neither legalism nor being a libertine. A libertine is a person who toss out all standards and all rules and regulations.